Welcome to TYT Interviews. Guess what kind of interview we have for you today? An awesome one. You got it. It's Josh Clark. He's from the wildly popular Stuff You Should Know podcast. And now, let me tell you guys a little bit about it. First of all, it ranks in the top 10 consistently on iTunes. Not a big deal. 1 million downloads per week, usually. Not a big deal. It covers fields of science, history, urban legends, pop culture. Won the 2014 People's Voice Webby Awards in mobile podcast. Not a big deal. / we kind of like it. So, Josh, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you for having me on, Cenk. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for coming on. All right, so for those 3 Americans left who are not familiar with the podcast, fill us in a little bit more. What do you guys do on a regular basis?
So, Stuff You Should Know, it's a podcast that comes out every Tuesday and every Thursday and has since 2008, actually. And we take dense, sometimes seemingly impenetrable topics and just kind of break them down into their component parts to just kind of explain how it works, which really kind of dovetails with the website that my co-host and I work for, How Stuff Works, which is the origination of the podcast Stuff You Should Know. That's where it all started. And so we've talked about everything from how disco works to how black holes work to tipping, just about anything you can imagine. We've got like 860 something episodes under our belt by now. So we've talked about all sorts of stuff. And we keep doing it every week because it's fun.
Okay, well, the minute you start mentioning topics, it makes me want to dive into that topic. One of the ones that you did was on dark money. I certainly want to talk about that. We got dark money, we got black holes. I'm seeing a theme here, but I can't help but ask. Okay, fine. How do black holes work?
Oh man, how do black holes work? Let me see. So basically, if you have a star, after a while, like a star is nothing but a big nuclear reactor, right? And these huge nuclear explosions push the energy outward, right? But at the same time, stars are so massive that gravity is acting upon it about as hard as it possibly can. But these nuclear explosions are keeping gravity at bay. Well, eventually, the nuclear fuel runs out and the explosions dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until finally gravity overcomes the nuclear power of the star, and it overcomes it with such force that whatever fuel is left is condensed into this incredibly small but incredibly dense ball. It's so dense that it still has the same amount of gravity acting on it, but it actually bends the fabric of space-time into basically a cubbyhole. And anything at the edge of this cubbyhole that goes in, what you call information, whether it be light or a dog, is going to be lost forever in this infinitely dense hole in the fabric of space and time.
Cool. So
yeah, I know it is. I mean, that's my job. I get to go learn stuff like that, and I get to do it every week, and it's good work. I enjoy it tremendously.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. I could then get into, well, we're going to do time travel, yada yada. But okay, we'll leave that for now. It leads to the obvious question of, how do you guys know all this stuff? Hey, I imagine that you didn't wake up one morning, you're like, well, since I know about black holes and history and politics, I will now do a show on all those. So how do you guys prepare this show?
So I think one of the things that we established very early on is we're like professional dilettantes. Like, we're interested by all this different stuff, but we're not experts in any of it. We just go research things and we explain it to people. So I think just our interest in research drives us tremendously to keep asking more and more questions. Like, we figured out if we come across a question in research and we don't answer it, that question is going to come across one of our listeners' minds at some point as well. And we don't want them to have unanswered questions by the time they finish the episode. So we just keep pursuing thread after thread after thread until we fully understand a topic. And when we do research, when we start, it all starts almost exclusively with an article from How Stuff Works. And then Chuck and I will go off and research on our own. But the article will kind of form the structure, the basis of the podcast episode. And then as we're doing research, we come up with our own questions and just kind of go and accumulate as much knowledge as we can about the topic, and then come back together and sit at a table and press record, and then we have a conversation about it. And for the most part, the episode you hear is just a minimally edited version of what we recorded. So we usually just do it in one take. And I think that kind of lends to the laid-back feel of the podcast that people seem to like a lot.
Yeah, I can sense it's laid back by the rich mahogany behind you on the wall.
Yeah, and the armchair I'm sitting in. Like, I'm trying to sit upright, and I can't.
Yeah, no. It makes me want to have hot chocolate next to you over there in Atlanta. Okay, so by the way, Chuck Bryan is Josh's co-host on Stuff You Should Know podcast. So, Josh, it also said on here that you guys sometimes talk about conspiracy theories. I'm not even sure this counts as one, but I'm sure traditional people would think it does. Who killed JFK?
Did you know that Woody Harrelson's father allegedly copped to killing JFK, or being part of the crew that did kill JFK?
Yeah, that is trippy,
I think in a shootout with police once.
Yeah, no, I'm positive that most people don't know that. So what is that theory, Josh?
Well, I think he was trying to negotiate his way into federal penitentiary rather than a much less preferable state penitentiary. So I think during a standoff with police, he was talking to the negotiator about how he was involved in killing JFK. I don't think it worked. I think he still went to state pen, although I'm not 100% certain about that. But I don't think anyone said, well, he definitively killed JFK, because he didn't. Who killed JFK? The answer to your original question, I don't know that one. We did one on the moon, the moon landing, and whether or not that was a hoax, or whether or not Stanley Kubrick was behind it. We concluded that it very likely was not a hoax. And for the most part, when it comes to conspiracy theories, we found that just through our research, we tend to end up discarding them, kind of falling on the side of the skeptics. But I think one of the things we really pride ourselves on is that we don't just immediately dismiss it as just some crackpot idea. Like, we're willing to dive into it and explain why it's a crackpot idea, if it is a crackpot idea, which it usually is.
Okay. All right, I'm going to keep on going with our theme here. What's on the dark side of the moon, and why is Fox News against it?
So only Pink Floyd knows what's on the dark side of the moon. Allegedly, it's very much like the side of the moon that we see, except a little more battered. There's a lot more craters on that side, because it's basically the side that we see is protected from asteroids and meteorites hitting the moon because it's facing us, but the backside takes all of the brunt of that. So it's a little more pockmarked. How about that? Fox News, who knows?
No, I'm kidding about Fox News. With the moon, the tides go in, tides go out. They can't explain that. But you guys can.
We've actually done one on that too, and I don't agree with him, but I don't think it's magic or anything. But I get where Bill O'Reilly's coming from, because it is a colossally mind-bending thing to wrap your head around, the tides and the tidal effects of the moon. It's not as simple as the moon moving around and stretching the oceans on Earth. It's really kind of tough to understand. So if he was just throwing up his hand saying, who knows, it's magic, I get where he's coming from. If he was saying it's magic, then I disagree with him.
Yeah, so do I. Not little less likely to be Jesus or Muhammad than it is the moon. But there's stuff that you guys explained. By the way, I was kidding around about the dark side of the moon, but I actually didn't know what you just said. And it turns out the moon's like Barbra Streisand. It always wants us to look at its good side. So
right, oh yeah.
I didn't know that the other side of the moon is ugly. I'm going to tell my kids that today.
Yeah, you don't even want to see the dark side of the moon. It's hideous.
Yeah. The moon is Two-Face. It's a Batman villain.
Right, yeah. Harvey Dent.
That's right. Okay, so now let's get on to our favorite topic, politics, and specifically, actually, money and politics. So you guys did a segment on dark money.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the difference between dark money and regular money?
Dark money comes from anonymous donors in vast quantities and can very easily be used to sway public opinion toward the interests of a very wealthy handful of individuals. Regular money can get you a cheeseburger, you know? That's the big difference between the two.
Okay, see, I already love this explanation. All right, now, in terms of dark money, how do they do it? Like, is there a loophole that allows them to funnel money in secretly? Because even in Citizens United, Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, said, well, you should be able to know where the money came from, yet we don't.
Yeah, man, Citizens United is just one of the most colossal mistakes the Supreme Court's made, maybe ever, probably since the 19th century when they ruled, or when they added into their notes that a corporation is an artificial person. It's just so contrary to not just the public will, but the stated will of Congress, that basically an activist Supreme Court decided that they were going to once and for all settle campaign finance, and it blew up in their face. The whole ruling was based on Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, which is a pretty schlubby case to begin with. Citizens United is a conservative group that had been banned from promoting basically what amounted to a Hillary attack ad in documentary film form within, I think, 60 days of the primary, which was in violation of federal election code, right? Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court said, this is a boring case, we're going to spice it up. We're going to say political speech or money, political contributions, money, is equated with political speech, which is protected by the First Amendment. It's part one. Part two is we're going to uphold this 19th century idea that a corporation is an artificial person and that they enjoy the same rights under the Constitution as a normal person, a real person. So therefore, corporations can give unfettered amounts of money as political speech to political groups. Not candidates, they're still banned from that for now, but they can give as much as they want to political groups. And then they went over and said, and by the way, we want to say quite clearly, I think 8-1 with only Clarence Thomas dissenting, that the transparency requirements for political contributions are totally constitutional. We, the Supreme Court, say transparency is a must when it comes to political contributions, right? So they figured that if they put those two things together, they would have settled campaign finance once and for all. Everybody can just throw as much money as they want, but they have to disclose how much money they're giving and who they're giving it to. Well, the big problem is that the Supreme Court, they very much misplaced their faith in the transparency mechanisms that were already in place. The Federal Elections Commission, the IRS, Securities and Exchange Commission, all of these were had already been hamstrung or were in the process of being hamstrung by Senate GOPs led by Mitch McConnell, who hates campaign finance reform laws. He considers them a clear violation of free speech, and he actually has a major campaign finance reform case ruled on by the Supreme Court with his name on it, McConnell versus the FEC. So he's a crusader against this kind of thing, and he went along and said, the Federal Elections Commission, we're going to make sure that it enters a deadlock over anything that has to do with campaign finance reform. So there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and they're canceling each other out. So the Federal Elections Commission has been taken out of the game. And they're supposed to be the sheriff, the cops of all of this. The IRS started to kind of look into groups and how much they were spending on political campaigning and whether or not they were violating their charter. And the head of the IRS got called before Congress, raked over the coals, and then fired. So the IRS was taken out of it. Securities and Exchange Commission, basically the same thing that's going on. So what you have is a ruling that says everybody can throw as much money as they want at political action groups, and there's nobody policing it now. That's what happened with Citizens United, and that's the reality that we're in right now. It's basically just open season because the sheriff is out to lunch indefinitely, and everybody can just do what they want in basically rigging elections.
So do both sides do it equally, or does one side do it more in your analysis of it? Now, obviously, you mentioned Mitch McConnell there, who's the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. And there might be some chance that his concern about money in politics doesn't really have to do with freedom of speech, but has to do with the fact that Republicans are a little better at getting bribed. But maybe only a little. So what's your take on that?
A lot of journalists, and I consider myself a podcaster, not a journalist, but a lot of journalists go out of their way to say, oh, by the way, though, Democrats do this too. George Soros kind of thing, right? It's very disingenuous to do that. It's kind of part of the established media that you try to keep things balanced and objective, right? But when it comes to this, it's very much imbalanced. In the 2014 primaries, the GOP outspent the Democrats something like 100 million to 30 million as far as dark money goes, and that tends to be the case. It's something like overall, from what I understand, the GOP outspends the Democrats something like 8-1 when it comes to dark money. So yes, both are using this tactic of using dark money, but definitely the GOP is using it much more and much more to their advantage from my research.
And Josh, when you state facts like that, and that's not your opinion, that's a fact. As far as we can track it, we meaning not you and I, but outside groups whose job is to track this, yes, right. Republicans use dark money at a much greater rate. That might be why they defended in the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah.
So, but nonetheless, when you state things like that, do you ever get a pushback from your audience? Do they get mad at you if you get into politics? It depends. I mean, we try to remain as objective as possible, but when we come across a fact like that, of course we're going to mention it. But I think that fact in particular, starting out by saying both groups do it is disingenuous. Both groups do it like this, right, with the GOP outspending Democrats. But even throwing that fact in, we figured out, it kind of clouds the issue because it makes it divisive. And this is not a divisive issue because, yes, the GOP, I should say GOP candidates are receiving 8 times more than Democratic candidates are as far as dark money spending goes. But it's not really a conservative or a liberal issue. It's an issue where billionaires are basically now allowed unfettered access to elections, to campaigns, to influence the outcome of campaigns by electioneering. And one of the big problems with Citizens United was that it also overlooked a nonprofit group or a type of nonprofit called a 501c4. There's also a 501c6, but much more prominent is the 501c4. And it's a type of nonprofit that is allowed to engage in political activities, supposedly to a certain extent, but again, there's nobody policing what extent they're doing this to. They're allowed to raise unlimited amounts of money, and they don't have to disclose their donor roles, which means that people who funnel money into these 501c4s to, say, fund attack ads or misinformation ads to sway public opinion can remain anonymous. So you can have an entire ad campaign on an issue, say it's against the $15 an hour minimum wage, and it's just hammering how this is going to ruin small businesses. And really, if you step back and find out who's behind the 501c4 that's funding this attack ad campaign that's swaying public opinion, you find out it's a single billionaire or a small group of billionaires who don't want to have to pay $15 an hour in minimum wage. That might sway public opinion even more than the campaign, knowing that billionaires are taking this tactic. But that's not obvious. That's not exposed because there's anonymous donations that are going on, and it's allowing people to really have an outsized impact on how elections turn out, how campaigns turn out. Because, again, the Supreme Court equated political contributions with political speech. So that means that the more political contributions you have, the more political speech you've got. I don't have that much speech in my bank account. I don't know about you. I can't affect an election. I certainly can't affect how an issue pans out.
I think that that's unfair, but that's the legal state of affairs in the United States right now as far as elections go.
I'm amused by the idea that a bunch of regular American citizens would get together and spend millions of dollars to try to stop the minimum wage from going higher. Like, really,
Right.
I think that this could be a deep problem for America. Let's make sure the minimum wage is lower. All right, you got 10 bucks to throw into the till? No, of course it's the billionaire businessmen who are behind it.
Or like a local co-op of small businesses pooled their money and came up with a national ad campaign against it, you know?
Of course not. And then, the Supreme Court, their opinion is so absurd, so comical, because if you just do one more logical extension of that idea, well, if political contributions are speech and money is always speech, well, then why can't I just bribe a politician? Here, I'm going to give you $1 million. I'm just talking to you. I'm talking to you. And I'm not giving it to your campaign. I'm giving it to you. I'm going to give you $1 million because it's just political speech.
Right, and there's a couple of barriers. There's one called the Tillman Act that dates back to the Teddy Roosevelt administration, where it says corporations cannot directly contribute to a candidacy. They're chipping away at that right now. That's the next one that's on the chopping block. In which case, the corporations won't need 501c4s or anything like that. They'll just say, here you go, candidate. Go out and win the election and make sure you do my bidding when you get into office.
Yay, that sounds great. Okay, by the way, speaking of both sides do it, there certainly was an issue between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side. And most of the mainstream media seemed outraged at the suggestion that that if you take millions of dollars from a donor, you might actually do a favor for them. They thought that there was an outrageous charge by Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Is it outrageous, or do these politicians sometimes deliver when they get those millions of dollars?
Well, I know that Bill Clinton, when he was president, there was an enormous scandal that actually helped lead to the McCain-Feingold Reform Act, where during his re-election campaign, he was basically selling access to himself and the White House in exchange for donations to the PACs that were supporting him. And that was an enormous scandal. I don't imagine that the playbook is any different than it was in the 90s for Hillary Clinton's campaign. But I don't know I can't say specifically. What I can say is that, no, it's not an outrageous allegation. It may not be as egregious as, here's some money, go get me out of trouble, although that's been shown to happen time after time after time. But even more than that, it has a little more of a nuanced effect, right? So let's say you are a very well-off contributor, donor, to whether it's Democrat or Republican. You are going to interact with that candidate more times than, say, the average person who contributes $200 and shows up to like a town hall meeting once will have with that candidate, right? So the candidate comes to see that very wealthy person as their base, their electorate. Like, this is who they're reaching out to, because this is who they're interacting with, and this is whose interests they're hearing night after night after night. So it might not have like a necessarily a quid pro quo effect, although it definitely can and does. It's not an outrageous allegation, but it's more pernicious than that, in that it has an overall effect on the mentality of the person who's campaigning for election, that these are the interests that they need to be looking out for, because these are the interests they're hearing about most frequently.
All right, Josh, one last thing on dark money. I know that I have my solution. I started a whole PAC to get rid of this issue, to fight all the other PACs. It's called Wolf PAC. But I'm always curious what everybody's thoughts on it are. So what's your take on this? What's your solution on how to end this nonsense?
My solution is not as studied as the problem. I'm sure there's a lot of pitfalls to it as well. But I think that strictly public financing of a campaign up to a certain amount, there would have to be some sort of requirement, so you didn't just exclude people willy-nilly and say, you two can run for president, here's your $100 million. So there would need to be some criteria that a person could meet and then receive, say, $100 million to run for president. But I think, I'm sure there's inherently flaws in that idea, but I think there are probably way fewer flaws and fewer chances for corruption than there are for private contributions from wealthy donors and corporations to a campaign, which is the case right now.
Totally agreed. All right, so Josh, one last question about the podcast. As I look at the list of all the things you guys have covered recently, yes, I want to ask about every single one. That's why people are into it, and that's why it's successful. But I can't leave today without asking, why are so many disembodied feet washing ashore in British Columbia?
Oh man, that's one of my favorite topics. Like I walked around like just talking about that. I couldn't stop talking about it. It turns out, and there's been, I think, 17 feet that have washed up, mostly wearing cross trainers or running shoes, ashore in like British Columbia area over, I think, the last 8 or 9 years. And they finally figured out, of course, everybody's like, well, there's a serial killer chopping people's feet off and throwing them into the sea. And the cops figured out that what was happening was people were lost at sea. Maybe they went down in a plane or something like that. And as their body decomposed, their foot would disarticulate. And normally, the foot would just kind of fall to the side and lay at the seafloor and continue decomposing and be food for shrimp. But if it's wearing like a cross trainer or running shoe, which has air pumped into the soles, it would eventually probably float to the top and hit the surface of the sea, where it would just kind of meander for a little while, protected, because it's upside down, protected by the sole, and it would go wash ashore on one of the islands in British Columbia and be found by some unlucky 12-year-old girl on a camping trip with her family.
Wow. That is stuff you should know.
It's pretty great.
I had no idea. So that is super fascinating. I'm surprised CNN's not on that. It involves missing planes. Okay. The podcast is Stuff You Should Know. Josh Clark hosts it, as well as Chuck Bryant. Josh, super fascinating. Thanks so much for being on with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. This has been fun.